Thank you. Yeah, welcome back. Welcome back. Wolfgang, you know the name. I'm just waiting for the presentation to show up. There it is. Excellent. And the topic of the lightning talk matches pretty good in what we just heard before, because it is about security. And the talk is API Guard, better protect your Zabbix API. And I will do it real quick. Let's talk about the motivation. I think you know that we do some integration stuff with Zabbix. We play a lot with the API. We have customers, and especially when we're using API integrations, we communicate with the API endpoint, which is usually the API JSON RPC.php. So /Zabbix /whatever, and then API JSON RPC.php, and if you would like to get access from the internet to this API point, then people do not always feel very comfortable with that. So it's often undesirable to expose the entire front end there. And then you come up with solutions like a VPN or with static firewall rules. And if you, for example, use an application like we have outside in our offering, then this is very hard to implement actually. So it's not suitable. So the question is, can there be a way where we can protect our API endpoint, where we not expose our front end, but still have access to the API via the internet? And then we came up with a very simple idea I would like to share with you here in this small lightning talk. And that is our API Guard idea. And basically what we thought is if you treat a VPN or a firewall rule as some sort of access control, and then if this access control is successful, you forward the request to the authorization in this case here. Then if you have something like this in place, it would be pretty much fulfill what we are looking for. And that is exactly what the API Guard does. It's very simple, it's very basic. We add an additional Beaver token to the request. You all know that the Zabbix API is based on is an HTTP-based RPC API. So we have an HTTP header, so we can attach an additional header to the HTTP header. And then we use this additional header to authenticate or to make sure that we have access. And if there's an access, then we pass over the request to the Zabbix API. And this is how it looks like. So we have in blue our API-based application, whatever that is. And this application sends a post request. That's the way the Zabbix RPC API works, sends a post request. And we add an additional header and pass over a Beaver token. And then the API Guard checks for the existence of this token. And if this token is valid and fine, then it will forward the request to the API. And if the token is not available or is invalid, then it will deny the request. So that's basically the idea. And this slide shows just the access handling. So we might have an invalid API request. For example, get API JSON RPC PHP would not work, so we would deny that one. And a post with an invalid token or with a missing token would get rejected also. So in no case you would get access to the entire front end. Everything is working fine. You can also add a reverse proxy to the mix, which is not uncommon. So in this case, you have the request from the outside. You have your reverse proxy set up there. And then the reverse proxy forwards the request to the API Guard. And the API Guard in yellow here sits in the middle between the Zabbix front end, who finally provides the API endpoint, and the reverse proxy, and everything works fine. So that's the design idea of this API Guard thing. And following this approach, you can even do more. So for example, let's say we have different Zabbix servers here, Zabbix server 1 and Zabbix server 2, all behind the same API Guard, maybe behind the same reverse proxy server. And then we can use the API Guard to actually redirect the request to the proper system. So in this case, it would work like an application router or whatever you would call that one. And the configuration for the API Guard is pretty simple and straightforward. We have targets. You can see on On the right-hand side, we can see our target, Zabbix 1, and we can assign an URL to Zabbix 1 and a set of tokens, and we can do the same for Zabbix 2, and if there is a match on the token, then the request will be forwarded to the proper destination. And again, you will only be able to access the Zabbix API here. You won't have access to the entire front end, just the Zabbix API. So here we see a complete example configuration of how it looks like. So we have here a setup for Zabbix 5 instance, and here a setup for Zabbix 6 instance. Doesn't matter. Here are the URLs that are being used. Here are the tokens. And any of this token is valid and will forward the request to this URL. So that's basically the idea. So if I use, for example, the token Zabbix 5 token, then it will be forwarded to this instance. If I'm using Zabbix 6 token, it will be forwarded to the other token. And here you see an example using curl, yeah, as to actually perform the request. I think that is pretty straightforward. And you see we just make a change here and pass an additional header, this beaver token here, and you see this one responds with 5.4, for example, and this one responds with 6.2. And if you have an invalid token, an invalid request, or something missing, then you get something like 401 and access is denied. Yeah? So that's basically the idea of the API guard solution. You can monitor this API guard, which is pretty nice, so you can see how many requests are allowed, how many requests are done, and how many requests are rejected. So a lot of this stuff, and how many data is passing forth and back, and so on. Yeah, and again, as with the other modules that I showed you, we made this available on GitHub, so feel free to use it, and maybe it secures your Zabbix API next time. Thank you so much.